Well, the start to 2020 is almost upon us, marking the end of 2019 as well as a decade. So today we're going to recall some of the more significant news from the past 10 years, and then we're going to focus in on 2019 because there are also a fair number of happenings this year. Exactly 10 years ago, at the end of 2009, various things had just happened. I thought we'd walk down memory lane a little bit. Oshman Family JCC had just opened that fall. Facebook was settling into the Stanford Research Park. Palo Alto was reeling from a series of youth suicides. The country was trying to climb out of the Great Recession, and local businesses were happy to have defeated a tax measure. Gennady, are we taxing businesses yet?
It looks like it might start happening again next year.
Okay. 2020 might be the year.
Yeah, all the things you recapped and just makes me kind of realize how many of these stories are still relevant today and how little has changed in 10 years.
Yeah.
Although, obviously, these stories are in very different places now.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the.
Well, I remember like 2009, like actually starting in fall 2018 when the city council endorsed Proposition 1A.
2008,
providing money for high-speed rail. 2009 is when the conversation kind of, how do I avoid a pun?
No, you can't. It went off the rails, yes.
But people started like waking up to what high-speed rail would look like and its possible impacts on Palo Alto. And we've had some of the most heated meetings in the last 10 years during that time pertaining to high-speed rail.
Yeah.
And of course, over the past few years, rail has once again been a huge issue. High-speed rail has kind of faded into the background, but Caltrain's growth is the more immediate concern, which is basically seen as both a very good thing, but with potential local impacts on traffic congestion on streets. Yeah. And so that's been a huge year, like for the Great Separation effort. And so, and of course, on housing, that's been a story stretching through the whole decade, but it's kind of amazing what the contrast is between the discussion now and the discussion we were having 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Because back then, you mentioned JCC has been just built, and there's also were a few big apartment and condo complexes when we talk about like East Meadow. So there was concern about too much housing, and the city has been limiting that and considering area plans for those areas. Now, of course, we've gone full circle, and housing is the biggest kind of concern as far as shortage.
Yeah, the zoning has changed a whole lot in terms of like the city trying to incentivize what it wants. And of course, in the last 10 years, we had Buena Vista Mobile Home Park. The owners wanted to sell. There was a big protest. It took 4 years, I believe.
It's been a while. I feel like almost every giant story on my beat for the past decade has touched on housing in one form or another.
Yeah.
Whether we're talking about the Maybell referendum, which ended up reshaping Palo Alto's whole like city council composition the following year. They happened in 2013 and 2014. Those are the two elections.
Yeah.
The Buena Vista you just mentioned, the debates over the comprehensive plan, which stretched almost throughout the whole decade.
Yeah.
And that designated the city's housing goals. And then the more recent efforts to meet those goals, which have not gone as planned, but led to a lot of zoning changes and certainly changed the tenor of the conversation.
Yeah. I wanted to throw out electrical power because in 2010 there was a plane crash, a private plane crash into East Palo Alto that clipped the power lines, PG&E power lines, and that kind of made people realize just how vulnerable this city is. The power went out here, various parts of the cities surrounding us. There was a lot of talk then about like, oh, we need to have an alternative power source. Talk about microgrids have come up. A lot of people trying to become more reliant through solar power, and now the PG&E shutoffs are happening. It seems like we haven't moved a whole lot from that point.
We've gone from discussing about how vulnerable the electric grid is to going all in on electric and requiring all electric houses and having natural gas be the bad guy now.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, the city's gone all electric in its carbon neutral in its electric portfolio. That was a big thing that happened this weekend, but that made the city rely more on electricity for the cause of sustainability, but that doesn't really solve the vulnerability issues.
Yes, the transmission issue too. What are some of the things that happened in the past decade on the schools and youth beat?
Looking back, I think youth mental health was a huge theme. You mentioned, unfortunately, this decade saw 2 separate youth suicide clusters in 2009, 2010, and again in 2014, stretching through 2016. But I think that the advocacy and the awareness that was generated during those periods of crisis really laid the groundwork for huge changes at the schools, the wellness centers, new social emotional learning curriculum, change to the bell schedules, the elimination of zero period. So the changes that felt like within the power of the district to make life better for students and less stressful for students at school, they tackled. And next year, there's going to be a youth mental health center in Palo Alto, which is going to be open to any youth who want to walk in.
Yeah.
This is the Alcove Center,
That'll
and
be
that in and
Midtown.
of itself, just as like a physical representation of the progress
Yeah.
that's been made, is so incredible. And that the work on that really started in response to the most recent suicide cluster.
Yeah, youth, I mean, the generation that had to deal with these suicides, they took a real lead in trying to change things. And I think the whole culture at the high schools is very different than it was probably 10 years ago.
I think so too. And I think even thinking back to the way that people responded to our coverage of youth suicide, and at the beginning in 2014 being very resistant to any stories about it because they really worried about contagion, which are all legitimate issues. And I've experienced just a shift in people being more open to talking about these issues, being more open to it just being covered in different kinds of ways in our stories, particularly, outside of the crisis, and continuing to sort of dig into the topic of youth mental health and sort of adjacent issues beyond just when the suicides were happening. So I saw an openness around it sort of develop over those years.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I'd say to see the progress in taking responsibility and coming up with different solutions. Some programs work, some programs not so much, but always with an idea of trying to improve mental wellness among the youth and stuff. Yeah.
I would say one effort that comes up a lot that has stalled a little bit that's adjacent to youth mental health is around homework. You hear school board member Ken Dauber bring this up all the time, but the district's homework policy being this supposed lever to really keep a lid on academic stress by limiting, the number of hours of homework students have.
Yeah.
And that not being really implemented seriously. And that's still sort of not totally under control, but it seems like something the district is wanting to work on in 2020.
Yeah. And I know we're going to cover this later, but there was a lot of turmoil in the district, including lots around Title IX.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, looking back, there were all the OCR investigations, Phil Winston's departure, Ronnie Farrell, who was a Pali teacher, who was had to leave, Kevin Sharp. There were so many cases, particularly at Pali, but there are also issues at Gunn. The OCR investigations finally came to a close this decade with some findings for the district in terms of Title IX violations and how to address them. And then, of course, in 2017, there was the shortly after the board signed the resolution agreement with OCR was this other student sexual assault case at Pali, which really brought to the surface these issues all over again, and a lot of community, student, and parent frustration around how that was handled. But I think, now the Title IX compliance feels much more under control, to the point that they had hired a full-time Title IX coordinator, and she has now gone part-time. And I wrote about this, and there was almost no response or pushback from the community. So I don't know if people just didn't pay attention to our coverage, but it seemed like, a few years ago that would have been something that really raised a lot of flags, and now people feel more confident in the process.
Yeah, and there is a process. I mean, it's
exactly.
a better defined process. Yeah. Let's turn our attention then to this past year and talk about, first of all, what was the biggest news event, in your opinion, for the year? And we'll start with Janati.
Well, I agonized over this one because I hate naming as the biggest news of the year something that did not happen. But as a result of this something not happening, many things did happen, so it still qualifies. I'm talking, of course, about Stanford general use permit and the fact that this process that took years collapsed this fall. Stanford withdrew its application, and as a result, its future plans for expansion are kind of in flux. But we expected the Board of Supervisors to make a ruling on it in November, and just days before that happened, like the balloon popped. But the reason I think it's still extremely significant, even though the application didn't advance, is because of all the analysis, all the studies, all the partnerships, all the conversations that took happen over the past 3 years, which I think are going to influence many cities and many agencies going forward. I mean, this touches on Elena's beat, but certainly the school board has had a lot of conversations with Stanford, and they seemed to be pretty happy about the new partnerships that the GUP application kind of, the conversations they were forced to have. We had San Mateo cities kind of creating their own alliance and kind of pushing back against Stanford's proposed mitigation strategies. And of course, we had Palo Alto and Stanford, the county and Stanford. And as a result of this effort, we have all sorts of studies that quantify in ways that we couldn't quantify before the impacts of building, whether it's academic space, commercial space, on things like traffic and housing demand. We had a study showing Stanford's potential to expand, which, again, it was kind of led by Joe Simidian and the county staff. So I do think these documents are going to stand the test of time, at least for the next few years, and help provide more solid analysis for other types of developments going forward. And I think these conversations will kind of remain important. I think it's interesting that San Mateo County cities just realized as part of this process that they're entitled to funds from Santa Clara County for affordable housing. So that could be a tangible effect that could lead to housing, even if the GUP doesn't happen. So again, it's a huge project, biggest in county's history. Did not happen, but I do think many things will happen because it did not happen.
Lots of groundwork laid, and of course the possibility is going to be out there that Stanford will come back at some point.
I'd say the probability. It's just a matter of what.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. What about you? What about the news of the year?
One of the most defining local and national stories was Operation Varsity Blues, which was the college admissions scandal. Which really captured so much of people's attention this year, particularly locally because there were local parents who were indicted. And it really laid bare all the inequities in the college admission system, which I think, when I was talking to people in the sort of aftermath reporting of it was not so surprising. These are issues that are well established and that students and college counselors grapple with every year in terms of just, the privileged, resourced families getting in different ways, that are not just this very shocking side door that was described as part of this case, and ways that are kind of generally accepted and not pushed back on because they just happen and they're part of the system. And one of the really interesting local results, I thought, from the college admissions scandal was at Pali, where the Campanile editors decided not to publish their college map, and they were partly influenced by this whole issue and feeling like there was this toxic competitive environment around college admissions.
We'll call it the arms race.
Yes, and then, these students wanted to take a stand against that, and not everyone was happy about that, and I thought it was interesting that they made that choice.
Yeah, I think like the Stanford GUP, this news raised issues that people discussed about whether, there's this inherent bias towards, people who have tutoring, people who have college admissions counseling, people who, the whole 9 yards. And it seems like that was a worthwhile discussion to have.
Yes. And of course, Stanford was also implicated in it through their sailing coach, and they announced towards the end of the year recommendations from an external review that they're going to implement around just tightening their donations policies, processes related to admissions, which seems like valuable change. Yeah.
Speaking of Stanford, I would say that the biggest news this year was the opening of the Stanford Hospital. That was 10 years in the making, $2 billion. And when we took a tour before it opened, as journalists, we go in there with kind of skepticism, trying to look for like what might be wrong, But I was just so impressed by all of the work that went into it. It's not only an enormous building with a lot of different parts that they needed to plan for, different types of scenarios, from patient care to like surgical suites, but just having to plan into the future for what is medicine going to be like in 10 years, and do we have the infrastructure for that? And there's the entire emergency room. How can we accommodate a disaster scenario? How can we expand room? I was kind of floored by the effort that went into that. So
sounds like the coolest new development I don't want to spend any time in.
Yeah, exactly. Nice. Hopefully that's the only time we have to spend there.
And that's also, we can go back to the decade news. That was also a big deal, like 10 years ago.
Yes.
We were going through approval process. So it's a good coda to the decade.
Yeah, exactly.
The hospital actually getting built.
Exactly, yeah.
What do you two see as the trends of the year in Palo Alto?
Quite a few. Some good, some bad. What's happening with police oversight isn't great. The city's battle against cars is still happening. That's a big trend. There's a new Department of Transportation with 15 people that's going to be tackling that. But that's still kind of getting started. I think the biggest trend this year has been kind of the city council increasingly aggressive stance on sustainability things. And Palo Alto has always talked a big game, and they've done a few things in the past, like the previously mentioned carbon neutral electric portfolio. But I feel like this year, they adopted climate change as an official council priority, which was kind of divisive. Some people think it's great. Other people called it virtue signaling, which was the most annoying word of the year, and people overtook it.
That's our phrase of the year.
I digress. They actually, I feel like they walked the walk on a lot of this. They retired the incinerator, which was the biggest CO2 emissions earlier in the year. They banned plastic straws, they banned produce bags, and they passed an ordinance against demolition, basically requiring deconstruction of old buildings and salvaging of materials. They banned natural gas in newly constructed buildings, and they ended the year with a new recycling water contract that they think is going to create a new drought-proof supply going on into the future. So I think that's quite a few tangible actions that I think I think they would support the people who wanted to make this a priority. It worked.
I think they can check that box.
I think they could.
For me, the trend was Palo Alto talks about it, but East Palo Alto does it. Because this year there are a number of openings of different infrastructure in East Palo Alto that Palo Alto is still trying to catch up on. One was a pedestrian bridge over 101 that cut from the west side to the east side of East Palo Alto. It cut the distance that people have to walk from 1.5 miles to a half mile. So there's a much better route now for people wanting to get around the city. So there's that. In contrast, I think they spent 18 months in building it. So that's in contrast to the pedestrian bridge that Palo Alto is going to build, and that's been in discussions for, I think it was 8 years at this point.
Yes, but did East Palo Alto have a design contest that didn't count? That's the key.
Well, we did a little extra there. Another thing, safe parking program. So there's been a lot of discussion in Palo Alto about the RVs along El Camino. East Palo Alto last year decided to open up a parking lot, so it's on city land. They rehabbed it, refurbished it, so that it could take 20 RVs. And apparently out of that program, 10 individuals or families have moved into housing, because it's not just a place to put your vehicle overnight. It comes with services, counseling, job training, and that kind of thing. And then there's one other.
I think the business tax. East Palo Alto passed it last year.
That's okay. There's more than one other. Light Tree Apartments is going to have. There's about 100 more apartments there. And when we talk about housing and the need to approve or incentivize developers, East Palo Alto is doing something right over there. They just have the land that makes it all make financial sense, because there's those 100 affordable units, and then the city itself is looking at another 800 market rate units that have been proposed and need to be scrutinized by the public process. So Palo Alto is struggling a little bit in that area.
57 units in the beginning of the year.
Yeah. So that's what I'd say.
Not much sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Let's move on to newsmakers, who individually has really risen to the top of people's consciousness this year. We'll start with Elena.
I have to say Chanel Miller. So she was, I think everyone knows who she is, but she was the woman who until this fall was anonymous. She had been sexually assaulted by Brock Turner at Stanford. And for so many years, even despite the fact that no one in the public knew who she was, her name just took on, or her pseudonym took on this incredible significance for all these issues that even before the Me Too movement and then continuing through the next few years, when sexual violence and gender norms and all these conversations really rose to the fore in so many different ways. So she came out publicly in advance of the publication of her memoir, which I think should be required reading for anyone, particularly at colleges.
Yeah.
And she's just become a really powerful voice for all of those issues that have become so important and that we're still grappling with in many ways.
Yeah. A lot of courage there.
Yes.
To come out. Yeah. Johnny, how about you?
Well, we had some new people in leadership positions this year. New fire chief, new city manager, Ed Shikata, kind of taking charge.
Yep.
And even though I've been kind of critical of the latest news with the police audits and things, I think for the most part he could be credited with being kind of very stable in terms of the city budget and how the meetings are run. I think he kind of is what the council expected.
Operations kind of guy.
Nuts and bolts, kind of getting things done. But I think my newsmaker of the year, and kind of going back to my news of the year, would have to be Joe Simiti. And I know he's been a little controversial in Town Square. Some people think
That's what makes people
he killed Stanford's
newsmakers.
project. Others thank him for protecting cities from the potential impacts of a project they felt was too huge. But however you feel about what he's done this year, he's been incredibly relevant. He's basically gave Palo Alto a huge voice in the Stanford Gov process, including bringing several meetings here. He commissioned most of the major studies that I had previously referenced about Stanford general use permit. And he was the prime advocate for the full mitigation approach, which basically requires Stanford to mitigate the traffic and housing impacts of all of its proposed growth. So love him or hate him, he was extremely relevant, and he was by far the leading player in this whole debate.
Yeah, he really took a leadership role. My newsmaker of the year is the woman who had the tirade about the MAGA hat in Starbucks. I don't think we need to name her because she's gone through enough, but I think her rant to a man who was wearing a red hat and then following him out into the alleyway and continuing to berate him and saying that he's Nazi scum, although he was Jewish, really kind of captured the kind of national feeling of polarization. And there's just so many things that incident captured because of the social media component. She went online and tried to dox him, and then people ended up doxing her instead. It really churned up quite a lot of feeling. And I think our story still gets hits on that we can see on Chartbeat, that people are still interested in reading about that. And
it's definitely the most 2019 story of the year.
Yeah, it was. The reactions and actions just kind of typified a lot this year. Yeah. So that brings us to either the word or the phrase that defined 2019. Who would like to go first?
I'll volunteer, Elena. I'm going to go with local control because we started out earlier this year in St. Patrick's Day. There was a huge event by people opposing Senate Bill 50, Scott Wiener's attempt to change the state law so that you can't have essentially single-family zoning near transit areas and near job-rich areas. And we had the council kind of align itself with the League of Cities position paper, taking a shot at one-size-fits-all bills, which is basically how a veiled attack on SB 50. And we've heard council members and critics of this legislation repeatedly talk about the need to preserve local control, the rights of cities to determine their own zoning laws. And Palo Alto tried to walk the walk by changing its own zoning laws to kind of give developers more incentives to build housing. To date, that hasn't worked. There hasn't been any takers. There's been one kind of taker in the San Antonio area whose project is expected to come in early next year, but it hasn't produced nearly the results the city council has hoped for. So all this talk of local control that was kind of dominating things this spring, we'd have to be a little more skeptical about it given the results it produced. When we discuss it again in the next few months, when SB 50, the altered version of it, gets back to the state Senate and these conversations resume.
Yeah, local control, good one.
So for the Palo Alto School District, on this episode last year, my phrase was getting the house in order.
Okay.
And I think you saw the results of that this year. And so this year I would say the word of the year is stability.
They listen to the webcast. Cool.
We're influencing things. Obviously, there were missteps and miscommunications along the way, but I think with this current school board and new superintendent Don Austin, there was just this level of calmness, focus on compliance, just that let's get things in order and then move on to the long-standing issues that we've wanted to tackle for a long time and just couldn't because there was so much upheaval going on. There was less turnover this year at the district office.
For sure,
There's new leadership in place in controversial departments, special ed, and in the budget office for the chief financial officer. They finished the union agreements on raises months earlier this year, which I've never seen happen before. They released proposals and counter proposals during the bargaining process, posted those on the district website, which I had never seen happen before.
Increased transparency.
I mentioned before the Title IX coordinator was able to go part-time because that process was secure enough. She didn't need to be around full-time. And so now you can see the focus start to shift to sort of the pedagogical, educational shifts that I think have been talked about for so long without and have really resisted progress. Most recently, the middle school math proposal, which is
Don't get me started. Anyway.
as a way to tackle the achievement gap, which for so long has just been something that the district tackled in fits and starts.
Yeah.
And so I think obviously stability is good. And
Yeah, I mean, Austin came in and was talking about sprint goals, I remember, and just this idea of let's get something done. Let's not launch a multi-committee 2-year process.
yeah, I think there's a new approach that's supported and encouraged by the board. And then Don Austin has sort of taken that on of let's try things and not be afraid to try and fail and then readjust as needed. Which is new for an organization like the school district. And so we'll see how that pans out in 2020.
Okay.
And for the Ravenswood School District, I would actually say the word of the year was disruption. There was a lot of upheaval this year. The very controversial superintendent, Gloria Hernandez-Goff, left in the spring. She was placed on administrative leave and then resigned. And that was almost a year after the previous board had renewed her contract amidst much community protest. And so that was a real shift, I think prompted in large part by the election of 2 new school board members, Tamara Chabot-Maheen and Stephanie Fitch, who voted for her to place her on leave, along with Maria Elena Goena-Mendoza. And Hernandez-Goff's departure put a lot in place for the rest of the year. Gina Sudaria has replaced her. I think staff morale particularly has just totally turned around with Gloria in place, and a lot of people are really hoping the board keeps her on permanently, although the board is launching a search for a permanent superintendent. And there are a lot of hard conversations that Gina has really taken on, particularly around school closures. I think the tone around that is quite different from last year when some of these issues sort of started to crop up under the previous superintendent's leadership.
Yeah. So in some ways, there is some stability that has
I think disruption
entered.
and can be a good and a bad thing, and
Yeah.
the school closures will be a huge disruption, but I think ultimately will be a good thing for the district's long-term health.
Yeah. I'd say that for me, the phrase of the year is doing our best. And that actually pulls from Chief Visual Journalist Magali Gauthier's photo essay from last week, in which she chose some of the best photos of the year and just showed a lot of people trying to make the world better or make their circumstances better, whether it was people who are living in the RVs, people who are just trying to hang on to housing here. They may be living out of the area in a different part of the state, but they're working here, they're living in RVs. There's people protesting what they want to see improve in the world, from detained children to mass shootings. They want change around that. And there was also the steps being taken to just build community after-school STEM programs, caregiving seminars, workshops, just people paying attention to that issue and trying to support the people who are making those personal sacrifices. So doing the best with what we had in 2019. I'm not sure that the whole year can be summed up as like either fractious or something else. There's just a lot. It was just kind of this weird year in which there were some things that were stalled out, some things that finally hit their goals, sort of oddball year. My impression.
But I think as local reporters, we had it better than the people on the national scene in some ways.
Yeah, for sure.
So we could talk about disruption in Palo Alto, but I do think one of the joys of doing this on a hyper-local level is you get a nice variety of good and bad news, as opposed to having, depending on how you see the world, everything either going right or everything either going wrong.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that wraps up our last webcast of 2019. Thanks for the walk back and the retrospective. We will start again next year and see what the next year has to hold. So thanks for watching this edition of Behind the Headlines. If you enjoyed it and thought anyone else would, please share this URL on social media or on email. And to stay up to date with all of the Palo Alto news, go to paloaltoonline.com or our Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter feeds. See you next year.